Hi everyone and welcome back to our literature lesson today. Today specifically we will talk about post-colonialism in literature. And as we continue talking about post-colonialism, this is just the first part of the two-part series in post-colonial literature. We have to first establish the aim of post-colonialism in literature. Okay, what are the aims of post-colonialism? It seeks ways of rewriting history from local perspective. That's number one. Number two is the fashion themes, which are specific to the realities of developing countries. Number three is to create characters who represent particular perspectives on life in those countries. Four, explore national identities in the context of newly emerging nationhoods. And lastly is to use or promote the use of language or languages inherent in the country. So these are the goal or the aims in studying post-colonialism in literature. So as we begin, I would always want to start my discussion on post-colonialism in this very powerful quote from Desmond Tutu. This is basically not post-colonialism but talking about colonialism. And it says here, when the missionaries came to Africa, they had the Bible and we had the land. They said, let us pray. We close our eyes. When we opened them, we had the Bible and they had the land. Now, this quote is in no other way an attack or assault to any religious perspective such as Christianity, who uses the Bible as their holy scripture, but this is just a quote, okay, that would probably be used to jumpstart or benchmark our discussion on post-colonialism. So this particular quote or statement from Desmond Tutu actually talks about colonialism and how the Western Empire, quote-unquote, or how the West used religion as a form of tool in colonizing different places, different territories, different nations. But of course, we know that the result is not just Christianizing them, quote-unquote, but you know what I mean, getting their lands and territories and invading them. That quote represents a lot of the consciousness of post-colonial writers and post-colonial readers of literature. By the way, post-colonialism is not just a literary theory, but this is also a separate discussion on politics and sociology, and of course in philosophy as well. That's why in this particular episode, we will only zero in on post-colonial literature or post-colonialism in literature. Okay, so what is post-colonialism? Post-colonialism, or the historical period or state of affairs representing the aftermath of Western colonialism, is a term that can also be used to describe the concurrent project to reclaim and rethink the history and agency of people subordinated under the various forms of imperialism. And when we talk about effects of imperialism, definitely we're talking about the effects of the Western Empire, Europe, and of course, that also includes, in effect, the United States of America, which along the way conquered, quote-unquote, conquered a lot of territories in the world, such as Africa, South America, and of course, the Philippines, among many. So I divided this short lecture on post-colonialism in literature into three specific parts. The first one is post-colonial literature. What is post-colonial literature? These are writings from those formerly colonized by Britain, France, Spain, and Portugal. And of course, along the way, we know that in the 21st century, we can also include the United States as a power or part of the Western power because they were colonized by England back then and they developed as a world power and also invaded, no apologies, invaded a lot of territories in the world. Now, the term post-colonial is used to cover all the culture affected by the imperial process from the moment of colonization to this day. Okay, so there are a lot of effects that we can see in our 21st century culture and society, which can also be traced back from the colonial power. The consciousness of the white people, the consciousness of the West is still being seen in our texts, in our literatures, as a form of oppression, as a form of expression as well, and as a form of unconscious beliefs. So these are the things that we should be conscious of and we will be deliberately looking into in terms of postcolonialism in literature. Take a look at this example from an African writer. His name is Leopold Sedar Senghor, and this poem says, I must hide him in my innermost veins, the ancestors whose stormy hide in shot with thunder and lightning, my animal protector, I must hide him, that I may not break the barriers of scandal. He is my faithful blood which demands fidelity, protecting my naked pride against myself and the scorn of luckier races. This is a good example of a post-colonial literature. This piece of poetry by an African writer, the title of the poem is Totem. And obviously, as you look at this short piece of poetry, you will see a lot of words, a lot of elements, as we may, that can be traced back from the influences of the colonial power when Europe conquered or invaded Africa. What are these? First, take a look at the ancestors. It is capitalized. Okay, so it can mean an emphasis for maybe an ancestor of the African people, or could it be also an ancestor that they cannot even trace back or define anymore because they are experiencing what we call a loss of identity? I will not answer it for you, but I want you to be conscious about it. I want you to take a look at that. It can be posing a question as to whether we have an ancestor that we want to recall or look back into, or probably an ancestor that they cannot even remember anymore. One of the themes of African literature is the search for identity, an identity that is African, an identity that is not dictated or attached or colored, quote unquote, by the Western Empire. And some African literatures would talk about or highlight the importance of the African culture as it is. But some African literatures as well in the 20th and 21st century would focus on the search for identity. Think about it. Who are the African people before the colonizers, before the Western Empire came? Can they still account the kind of people they are? Maybe yes, maybe no. But a better question is, as Filipinos, who are we in terms of our real identity? There are so many historical accounts that actually pushes us back to our real identity as Filipinos before the Spaniards came. But if you would also notice in a lot of our literatures, the identity that Filipinos back then are trying to embrace is actually an identity that is already mixed, an identity that is already influenced, unconsciously probably, by Spain, by our colonizers, and of course along the way America. So look at that as evidences in terms of studying post-colonial literatures. The search for identity, the kind of people we are back from the very origin of our race. Some people would say it's debatable because we cannot define Filipinos apart from us being colonized. And that statement in itself is already post-colonial in nature. Why can't we define who we are? Why can't we identify our very own people apart from the influences of the West? This phenomena is not just being experienced by the Philippines, but in so many territories that were colonized by the Western Empire, by the center, quote unquote, which we will talk about later on. Moving on, the poem also says, my animal protector, I must hide him, that I may not break the barriers of scandal. Look at that. In Africa, if you can picture it out, we know that it is full of animals and plants and forests. And this is the kind of richness in terms of resources African people have. But when the colonizers came, they labeled it probably as scandalous, being with animals, okay, being raising animals or probably petting them or living in the jungles, living in the forests where the presence of animals and all of these elements, according to them, quote unquote, are present. So it is a normal life for them, but when the colonizers came, they labeled it scandalous, to be with animals. That's why the poem mentioned they must hide it. He or she must hide it, according to the persona of the poem, because they will be labeled or called scandalous. Think about that. Why are these people the ones adjusting to the standard imposed by the West? That is another way of looking at literature in the post-colonial perspective. He is my faithful blood which demands fidelity, protecting my naked pride. So referring to the animal as an ally, as part of like the family. The animal actually protects the persona, according to the poem, in terms of his naked pride against himself and the scorn of luckier races. Now, another interesting mention in the text is the term luckier races. In Filipino, ang mga masaswerteng lahi. Who are these people? Who are these luckier races? What do you think the persona is trying to say as he mentioned luckier races? So if there are luckier races, so there are also in equation races that are underprivileged. And that is the theme of this particular piece of poetry. In a post-colonial perspective, there is always that separation, that gap, that disparity between a privileged race and the underprivileged ones. And that is evident in that piece of poetry and in many other post-colonial literatures as well. Next one. These literatures emerge in their present form out of the experience of colonization and asserted themselves by foregrounding the tension with the imperial power and by emphasizing their differences from the assumptions of the Imperial Center. So when we talk about the Imperial Center in post-colonialism, we are obviously talking about the powerful, okay, in other terminology, the hegemony, which we will talk about in part 2. But this imperial power is considered in post-colonialism as the center or the focal point of standards, if you may. So as the center, everything else in the margin of the center is being defined by the ones in the center. So when you talk about this luckier race, quote unquote, according to Totem, according to this poem, this Imperial Center obviously talks about the Western imperial power, the West, Europe. And of course, just like what we said a while ago, we can also consider the United States along the way as part of the Western power. And this Western imperial power defines everybody else in the margin. So whatever they believe as right, whatever they impose as true in the center, everything else in the margin, such as Africa, Latin America, the Philippines, and all colonized countries and regions, everybody else in the margin adjusts to the center. They comply or adjust in terms of their standards, their belief, with that of the center. The center defines everybody else. That is evident in post-colonialism in literature. Another thing that we need to look at is actually the study of English studies. Okay, it is an issue of translation, an issue of education, an issue of language and power. Okay, so we can always say in post-colonialism that language is attached to power, attached to the one who is powerful. And English studies, or the study of English, has always been a densely political and cultural phenomenon. A practice in which language and literature have both been called into the service of a profound and embracing nationalism. I remember thinking about international examination in English, such as IELTS and all of this TOEFL, for you to be able to work abroad or study abroad, particularly in the Western countries, in Europe, in America, in all of these powerful countries. All right, think about that. When you study or desire to study or work in these countries, you have to take English examinations, right? Because some would say that it talks about your effectivity in communication because you will be working with people who also speak the language. But if you fail the exam, it's like you not remembering English anymore, which is impossible. right? You probably would fail the exam because of one or two items, because of certain items that you are that is very technical for you, but that does not discredit the fact that you can speak the language. See, that's very funny, at the same time intriguing, that when you pass the exam, it's as if you are now a certified colonized person, right? You are being examined in the language of the colonizer, of the powerful, which is weird. Okay, so these funny examples can actually be attributed to a pressing issue on post-colonialism as well. Because English study, or the study of English as a language, is not just an issue of communication. It is an issue of power. Think about our literatures. It is always translated in English for us to be able to understand it. Simply means that we are playing on the playground of the colonizer when it comes to language. Okay, so everything that they would probably impose as part of the canon of literature, it is according to their consciousness, according to their perspective. Think about word literature. For example, in the traditional sense, you look at the canon of word literature, mostly these are littered with these white writers, these Europeans, Shakespeare, and all of this prominent figure in Europe and in America. Okay, we have James Joyce, we have Ernest Hemingway, these popular names, diba? We have these writers. I'm looking at the collection of my books, diba? We have all of this Thomas Hardy, Ralph Waldo Emerson, white writers, Edgar Allan Poe, which is brilliant when it comes to their literariness, but at the same time, it kind of communicates something in the consciousness of those who are reading it, particularly the periphery or the margin, such as the Filipinos, right? We are being littered with the consciousness of the white people. English study is very controversial. So if you are an English major, of course, you should be in the position of being critical as well about your subject matter. Because this is not just a form of communication, but this is also a critical discussion. Postcolonialism opens our eyes in terms of the unconscious and the conscious, deliberate imposition of power and influences of the Western Empire. The historical moment which saw the emergence of quote-unquote English as an academic discipline also produced the 19th century colonial form of imperialism, because everybody else is using English as a standard. From the 19th century, it continues to grow, 20th, until, of course, our modern or present day today. English has always been, or the study of English has always been the standard when it comes to education, when it comes to achievement and academic pursuit. And that is a subtle way of imposing power, of imposing influences. You are using the language of the colonizer. Okay, so I don't want to emphasize the American period in the Philippines, but you know what happens? We were taught the language, and of course, it was communicated as a form of education. But little did we know back then that it is also a good way of colonizing us. We were speaking the language of the powerful, of the colonizers, being one with them, embracing their ideologies. Because we know that in language, there is ideology. In language, in words and structures that we're studying, there is an attached belief or ideology. And we are unconsciously embracing it. A privileging norm was enthroned at the heart of the formation of English studies as a template for the denial of the value of the peripheral and the uncanonized, or the center. So when you talk about the peripheral, be familiar with this terminology. The peripheral or the peripheral view is actually on the perspective of the one viewing, which is the one in the center, at the center. So if you are at the center, you are the standard, the point, the focal point, the origin. Everything else that you see is in your peripheral or in your margin. Okay, so it's like the West looking at the East as part of their peripheral. Okay, so how much more the Far East? Okay, so we are actually being defined or labeled Far East in the perspective of the one opposite the East, which is the West. That's a very post-colonial perspective to begin with. Okay, so we are being viewed. And alongside us being viewed in the peripheral is also us being defined. Influences of the Western Empire is creeping in our consciousness. The desire for white skin as a standard of beauty. The desire to be eloquent in the use of English as a form of communication. These are subtle ways, embracing all of these ideologies from the West. Okay? Netflix would open our eyes and our consciousness in terms of the values of the West. All of this, I'm not saying it's bad, okay? But what I'm saying is be critical about it. The things that we litter our minds are basically influenced by the powerful, by the West. And in terms of ideology, we can also say that we are unconsciously embracing it. So those in the periphery immerse themselves in the imported culture, denying their origins as an attempt to become more English than English. That's an interesting point. More English than English. Okay, we wanted to not just embrace the standard of the West, but we also want to be like them and at times become better than them. We become more white than the white people in terms of ideology. We're not talking about color, but in terms of ideology, we become more white in terms of philosophy, in terms of academic pursuit, in terms of the so many things that define the Filipinos, the Filipino life. It is almost impossible for us to escape the influences of the West. That's the sad reality. I'm not saying it's impossible, but almost impossible because we keep on embracing it. We keep on putting it in our consciousness. We are not critical about it. We're not talking about waging war with the West in terms of weapon and territory, but we're talking about ideology here. We're talking about embracing an ideology that is not Asian, that is not Filipino. Some people would say that the Philippines is not really Asian. We probably are geographically located in Asia, but in terms of our way of life, we are not Asia. We are European and American. And of course, it can be traced back from the 333 years of Spanish rulership and the 40 plus years, if you may, of American influences. Not just 40, but of course, until now, the influences is still here in our reality, in our consciousness. These are the things that post-colonial literature would expose in our very eyes. As we study literature, we should be not just familiar, but we should be critical about these perspectives, these ideologies being imposed to our consciousness coming from the Western Empire. So next meeting, we will continue our discussion on post-colonial literature or post-colonialism in literature. So I will see you next meeting and we will continue our discussion on post-colonialism in literature. Bye everyone!